November 7, 1943. Somewhere over the English Channel, 4 American P-47 Thunderbolts are burning through their last drops of fuel. One pilot slams into a beach at full speed, his aircraft exploding into a fireball of twisted metal and sand. Another pilot rips open his canopy and throws himself into the freezing North Sea, his parachute barely opening before he hits the black water. A third pilot, hands shaking, pushes his dying engine to the absolute limit, and somehow crosses the coast of England with less than 2 minutes of fuel remaining. But the fourth pilot, Lieutenant William Roach of the 358th Fighter Squadron, makes a decision that will change the course of aerial warfare. He spots an airfield below. He lands perfectly. He follows a ground vehicle to a parking area. He shuts down his engine. And then he looks out the canopy and sees German soldiers running toward him with rifles raised. He is not in England. He is in Nazi-occupied France. His aircraft, a Republic P-47. Thunderbolt, nicknamed Beetle, is now the property of Adolf Hitler's Luftwaffe. And within 72 hours, one German test pilot will climb into that cockpit, fly that aircraft for 90 minutes, and write a report that accurately predicts the destruction of the entire German Air Force. His name was Hans Werner Lerche. Nobody listened to him, and 15,000 American pilots would prove him right. Context 100 to 530. To understand why one captured fighter mattered so much, you need to understand what was happening in the skies over Europe in late 1943. The Allied bomber offensive was tearing Germany apart, or at least that was the plan. In reality, the bombers were getting slaughtered. August 17, 1943. The United States 8th Air Force launched a massive bombing raid against the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt, deep inside Germany. 376 B-17 Flying Fortresses took off from England that morning. By sunset, 60 of them would never come back. That is a loss rate of 16% in a single mission. 600 American airmen killed, wounded, or captured in one afternoon. The problem was simple and devastating. American bombers could not protect themselves against German fighters. The Messerschmitt Bf-109 and Focke-Wulf Fw-190 were fast, deadly, and flown by experienced pilots who had been fighting since 1939. They tore into the bomber formations with cannons and rockets, and the bombers' defensive guns simply could not stop them all. American generals knew the answer. Fighter escorts. Send fighters alongside the bombers to protect them. But there was a problem that seemed impossible to solve. No American fighter had the range to fly all the way to targets deep inside Germany and back. The P-47 Thunderbolt, America's primary escort fighter, could fly roughly 450 miles before it had to turn back. Schweinfurt was 500 miles from England. That meant the bombers flew the most dangerous part of the mission alone. The Luftwaffe knew this. German fighter controllers watched the American escorts on radar, waited for them to turn back at the limit of their range, and then ordered their fighters to attack. It was systematic. It was efficient. It was killing Americans by the hundreds every week. Between June and October 1943, the 8th Air Force lost over 1,000 heavy bombers. That is more than 10,000 trained aircrew killed or captured in 4 months. The strategic bombing campaign, which was supposed to destroy Germany's ability to make war, was on the edge of total failure. American commanders were running out of options, running out of aircraft, and running out of men willing to climb into those bombers, knowing the odds. Germany was winning the air war. The Luftwaffe's fighters were superior in speed and agility. Their pilots were experienced killers with years of combat behind them. Their tactics were proven, and their confidence was high. But everything was about to change because of one man nobody was paying attention to. Character introduction, 5:30 to 9 o'clock. Hans Werner Lerche was not a hero in any traditional sense. He never shot down an enemy aircraft. He never led a squadron into battle. He never received the Knight's Cross or any of the flashy decorations that German propaganda loved to photograph. He was a test pilot, and in the hierarchy of Luftwaffe glamour, test pilots ranked somewhere between mechanics and weathermen. Born in 1916 in Breslau-Lärch, grew up in a Germany that was broken and humiliated after the First World War. His family had little money. There were no connections, no aristocratic name, no path into the officer class that dominated the military. What Lärch had was an obsession with flying and a mind that understood machines the way a musician understands instruments. He started with gliders in the early 1930s, those fragile wood and fabric contraptions that German youth used to learn aerodynamics because the Treaty of Versailles forbade Germany from having an air force. Every weekend, young Hans dragged gliders up hillsides and threw himself off cliffs, learning by instinct and near-death experience how aircraft behaved in the air. When Hitler came to power in 1933 and began secretly rebuilding the German military, Lärch found doors opening. He trained as both a pilot and an aeronautical engineer, a combination that made him extraordinarily valuable. By 1939, he was stationed at Rechlin, the Luftwaffe's premier aircraft testing facility, Germany's equivalent of Wright Field in America or Farnborough in Britain. His job was unique. While combat pilots flew one or two aircraft types and mastered them completely, Lärch flew everything. New German prototypes fresh from the factory, production aircraft being checked for quality, and most importantly, captured enemy planes that German intelligence wanted evaluated. His logbook would eventually record over 120 different aircraft types: Spitfires, Hurricanes, Mosquitoes, Soviet Yaks and Leges, American Mustangs and Lightnings. If it had wings and an engine and had been captured or shot down over German territory, Hans Werner Lärch probably flew it. What made Lärch dangerous to the Nazi establishment was his honesty. When a German aircraft was flawed, he said so in writing. When an enemy aircraft was superior, he documented exactly why. This was not what Nazi officials wanted to hear. They wanted reports confirming German superiority. They wanted data supporting the propaganda that German engineering was the finest in the world. Lärch gave them truth instead, and truth was an uncomfortable commodity in the Third Reich. And then on November 10, 1943, 3 days after Lieutenant Roach's catastrophic navigation error, Lärch walked across the tarmac at Rechlin toward a freshly painted P-47 Thunderbolt bearing Luftwaffe markings and the code T9 plus FK. He had read the intelligence briefings. He had heard the jokes. Every German pilot who saw the P-47 said the same things. It was fat. It was ugly. It was a flying milk bottle. American engineering at its worst, a nation of refrigerator manufacturers trying to build fighters. Crude, heavy, unsophisticated. A sledgehammer where a scalpel was needed. Lärch looked at the massive aircraft sitting on the concrete and felt something that 90 minutes of flying would transform into certainty. He felt doubt. The crazy discovery. 900 to 1400. Lärch began his walk-around inspection the way he always did, slowly and methodically. And the first thing he noticed contradicted everything the intelligence briefings had told him. The construction quality was superb. Not adequate, not acceptable, but genuinely excellent. Clean welds, precise panel gaps, high-grade aluminum alloy throughout. Every rivet was perfectly flush. Every access panel fit exactly. This was not the work of refrigerator factories churning out crude machines. This was sophisticated mass production at a level that German industry, increasingly battered by Allied bombing and material shortages, was struggling to maintain. He climbed into the cockpit and stopped. The space was enormous. A German pilot sitting in a Bf-109 cockpit was essentially wearing the aircraft. The canopy pressed against his head. His elbows touched the sides. Instrument access required contortion. After a 4-hour mission, pilots climbed out with neck cramps, back pain, and legs that had gone numb from being pressed into impossible positions. The P-47 cockpit was a different world. The seat was well padded and adjustable. There was room to move, to shift position, to stretch during long flights. The canopy was high and provided visibility in every direction. Lärch could see the ground clearly during taxi without having to crane his neck into uncomfortable angles. German engineers would have called this wasted space, Unnecessary comfort. Weight that could have been saved for performance. But Lurche, who had spent years flying multiple aircraft types on the same day and understood exactly what fatigue did to pilot performance, recognized something revolutionary. This was not wasted space. This was a cockpit designed for 8-hour missions. A pilot who was comfortable could concentrate. A pilot who could concentrate made fewer mistakes. A pilot who made fewer mistakes survived. Then he looked at the instrument panel and felt the hair stand up on the back of his neck. The gauges were color-coded. Green sections showed normal operating ranges. Red sections showed danger zones. A pilot could monitor his engine at a glance, without reading specific numbers, without memorizing temperature limits and pressure ranges, without the detailed technical knowledge that German aircraft demanded. Lurch understood immediately why this mattered. American fighter units included pilots from dozens of backgrounds. Free French, Polish, Norwegian pilots who spoke limited English. The color coding meant any pilot, regardless of language or training level, could operate the aircraft safely. Green is good. Red is bad. Universal. Intuitive. Brilliant. The throttle mixture control and propeller pitch were grouped together on the left side. Fuel system controls were clearly labeled. Everything was positioned exactly where a pilot's hand would naturally reach. German cockpit layouts had evolved over years of modifications, with new instruments and controls added wherever they could fit, creating an ergonomic nightmare that only experienced pilots could manage efficiently. The P-47 cockpit had been designed from the beginning with one question in mind. Can a pilot with 200 hours of training operate this aircraft effectively in combat? The answer was yes. And that question, that single design philosophy question, was something German engineers had never asked. He started the engine. The Pratt & Whitney 2800. Double Wasp 18 cylinders producing over 2,000 horsepower roared to life. And it was smooth. Beautifully, impossibly smooth. No vibration. No rough idle. No temperamental behavior requiring careful management. The engine ran like it could run forever. Lurche had flown enough captured Allied aircraft to recognize this pattern, but it still impressed him every time. American engines were consistently reliable across production batches. German engines, increasingly manufactured by forced labor in factories under bombardment, varied wildly in quality. An engine from one factory might run perfectly. The same engine type from another factory might fail within 50 hours. He received clearance and taxied to the runway. The broad landing gear tracked straight and stable. The tail wheel locked securely. Visibility was good. Ground handling was easy. In a Bf-109, taxiing was a constant battle. The narrow landing gear made the aircraft unstable. Inexperienced pilots regularly ground looped during taxi alone, damaging aircraft without any help from the enemy. Lurch advanced the throttle and felt the massive engine push the 7-ton fighter forward with authority. The takeoff roll was longer than a German fighter, but completely uneventful. The aircraft lifted off smoothly. He retracted the gear and began climbing. Initial results: 1400 to 1800. For 90 minutes, Hans Werner Lurche put the captured Thunderbolt through every test he knew. And with every maneuver, every system check, every performance measurement, the same conclusion built inside his engineer's mind, like pressure building inside a sealed container. The P-47 was not agile. It did not turn tightly. It did not have the instant snap response of a Bf-109 or the devastating roll rate of an Fu-190 at low altitude. In a classic dogfight, a turning fight at low altitude, a German fighter would win. But at altitude above 15,000 feet, the turbo supercharger transformed the aircraft. Where German fighters gasped in thin air, losing power and responsiveness, the P-47 accelerated. It maintained full engine performance at altitudes where Bf-109 pilots were nursing their engines and watching their instruments nervously. The dive performance was extraordinary. Lurche pushed the nose down, and the heavy fighter gathered speed like a boulder rolling downhill. The controls remained responsive. The aircraft remained stable. There was no flutter, no control stiffening, no tendency to tuck under at high speed. The P-47 could dive away from almost any opponent, and the opponent could not follow. But it was not the individual performance numbers that struck Lurch. It was the pattern. Everything worked. Every system functioned as designed. The hydraulics operated smoothly. The electrical systems were reliable. The engine never hiccuped, never surged, never gave a single moment of concern. He landed at Rechlin and taxied back to the hangar. Ground crew gathered around the ugly American fighter, waiting for the chief test pilot's verdict. Lurch climbed out, stood looking at the aircraft, and said something that confused every mechanic standing there. "It is the best designed operational fighter I have ever flown." They stared at him. Best designed. This grotesque, overweight, inelegant machine. Lurch tried to explain. It is not designed for performance. It is designed for operations. And there is a difference. A critical difference. That evening, Lurch wrote his report. The strategic assessment section contained a prediction that would prove accurate down to the last detail. The Americans have not built the best fighter. They have built the most operational fighter, and they can produce it in numbers we cannot match. Germany builds fighters for individual excellence. America builds fighters for industrial war. If we cannot match their operational availability, we will lose the air war, regardless of how superior our individual aircraft may be. He signed the report and submitted it through channels. Cliffhanger, 1800 to 1930. The report traveled up the chain of command. It was read by officers who frowned at its conclusions. It was discussed in meetings where men with political connections dismissed it as defeatist thinking. And then it was filed. Filed and forgotten. Because admitting that an American aircraft represented superior engineering philosophy meant admitting that German engineering was not supreme. And in Hitler's Germany, that admission was not just unpopular. It was dangerous. But history does not care about politics or pride or ideology. History cares about facts. And the facts were about to arrive over Germany in numbers that would darken the sky. Within 4 months of Lurch's ignored report, P-47 Thunderbolts would appear over the Reich in massive formations. Hundreds of them. Day after day. Mission after mission. And they would not stop coming. Every Thunderbolt shot down would be replaced by 2 more. Every American pilot killed would be replaced by 3 newly trained pilots. The production lines in Farmingdale, New York, and Evansville, Indiana, were building 1 P-47 every single hour. But the P-47 alone was not enough, because range was still the problem. The Thunderbolt still could not fly all the way to Berlin and back. The bombers were still dying in the hundreds, and somewhere in America, another aircraft was being prepared that would change everything. In Part 2, we will see what happened when the P-47 was joined by the aircraft that German pilots would come to fear more than any other. The aircraft that would finally break the Luftwaffe's back and turn Lurch's prediction into devastating reality. The question was no longer whether Germany could win the air war. The question was how long the Luftwaffe could survive it. November 10th, 1943. Hans Werner Lurch. Germany's chief test pilot climbed out of a captured American P-47 Thunderbolt and called it the best designed operational fighter he had ever flown. He wrote a report predicting that American industrial engineering would destroy the Luftwaffe. That report was filed dismissed and forgotten. But here is a number that should terrify you. Between January and June 1944, the Luftwaffe lost 21,000 aircraft, not to some wonder weapon, not to some secret technology. They lost them to exactly what Lurch had warned about: sustained operations by an enemy that could keep more planes flying more consistently with more pilots day after day after day. December 1943. Lurch's report sat in a filing cabinet at Rechlin, while the war machine he had tried to warn was grinding toward a cliff. The men who could have listened chose not to. The men who did listen had no power to act, and the clock was ticking toward the most devastating air campaign in human history. This is the story of how one man's truth was buried by an empire's arrogance, and how that arrogance cost Germany the sky. Institutional resistance. 1:30 to 6:30. To understand why Lurch's report was ignored, you need to understand who was running the Luftwaffe in late 1943, and the answer is not encouraging. Hermann Göring, Reichsmarschall and commander of the Luftwaffe, had once been a World War I ace. 22 victories, the pour le mérite around his neck. He had been a fighter pilot in an era when individual skill and personal courage decided everything. That experience had shaped his entire philosophy of air warfare, and by 1943, that philosophy was killing his own air force. Göring believed in aces. He believed in individual excellence. He believed that one brilliant German pilot in one superior German fighter was worth 10 American machines flown by 10 mediocre American boys. His senior staffmen like Generalleutnant Adolf Galland, the inspector of fighters, tried to tell him otherwise. Galland had been fighting the Americans for months. He knew what was coming. December 14, 1943. A meeting at the Air Ministry in Berlin. Galland stood before Göring and a room full of senior Luftwaffe officers. The subject was fighter production and pilot training. Galland had seen Lurch's report. He had read every word, and he had come to deliver the same message in person. Herr Reichsmarschall Galland began carefully. The American fighters are not what our intelligence has been reporting. The P-47 Thunderbolt in particular represents a design philosophy that prioritizes operational availability over individual performance. Our pilots are shooting them down, yes. But they keep coming. More of them every week. Göring's face darkened. He did not like bad news. He especially did not like bad news that suggested American engineering might be superior to German engineering in any way. "Are you telling me," Göring replied, his voice dangerously quiet, "that you believe American aircraft are better than ours?" "Not better in performance," Galland said. "Better in sustainability. Their aircraft are easier to maintain, easier to fly, and easier to produce. We are losing the numbers war, and our current production philosophy cannot close the gap." The room went silent. Every officer present knew what happened to people who told Göring things he did not want to hear. Galland pressed forward anyway. "I have read the Rechlin evaluation report on the captured P-47. Test pilot Lurch's assessment confirms what our frontline units are reporting. The Americans are not trying to build the best fighter. They are building the most operational fighter. And they are succeeding." Göring exploded. He called the report defeatist. He called Lurch's assessment contaminated by enemy propaganda. He accused Galland of losing his nerve. The meeting ended with Göring ordering that no further evaluations of captured aircraft should include strategic assessments. Technical data only. No opinions. No recommendations. No conclusions that might undermine confidence in German superiority. Lurch's report was not just ignored, it was actively suppressed. Back at Rechlin, Lurch heard about the meeting through unofficial channels. A colleague pulled him aside in the officers' mess and told him what had happened. "Your report made it to Berlin. Galland used it." Göring threw it in the trash and nearly had Galland relieved of command. Lurch felt something cold settle in his stomach. Not fear for himself. Fear for Germany. He was an engineer. He understood systems. And he could see that the Luftwaffe's command system was broken in a way that no amount of engineering could fix. The people making decisions were making them based on ideology, not data. And in a war of industrial attrition, ideology was worthless. But Lurch was not entirely alone. And the next piece of this story involves a man who had been listening very carefully from the shadows. The unexpected Ally 6:30 to 10:30. His name was Oberst Edgar Peterson, and he was the commander of Erprobungsstelle Rechlin, the entire testing facility where Lurch worked. Peterson was a pragmatist in a system that punished pragmatism. He had survived this long by knowing when to speak and when to stay silent. But he had read Lurch's report, and he knew it was right. Peterson called Lurch into his office in late December 1943. The door was closed. The conversation was not recorded in any official document. But from Lurch's later accounts, Peterson laid out the situation with brutal clarity. "Your report is accurate. I know it. Gallen knows it. Half the engineering staff at Rechlin knows it. But Göring has decided it is defeatist and challenging. Göring directly will accomplish nothing except getting both of us sent to the Eastern Front." "Then what do we do?" Lurch asked. Peterson leaned forward. "We cannot change the command philosophy, but we can change what the frontline units know. Circus Rosarius is touring captured aircraft to fighter bases across the Reich. Your P-47 evaluation Beetle is going with them. I want you to write a tactical briefing, not a strategic assessment. Technical strengths and weaknesses only. How to fight the P-47. How to avoid its strengths. Where its vulnerabilities are." Lurch understood immediately. Peterson was not asking him to lie. He was asking him to present the truth in a form that would not be rejected. If frontline pilots understood what the P-47 could do and could not do, they would survive longer. They might not be able to change the industrial equation, but they could adapt tactically. Through January 1944, Lurch worked with the Circus Rosarius team preparing the tactical briefing. He wrote detailed performance charts. He documented the P-47's climb rate, turn radius, dive speed, roll rate at various altitudes. He noted the critical altitude bands where the P-47's turbo supercharger gave it decisive advantages over German fighters. He included one recommendation that was technically tactical but strategically revolutionary. Do not engage the P-47 above 20,000 feet unless you have an energy advantage. The turbo supercharger gives it performance that our fighters cannot match at high altitude. Force engagements below 15,000 feet, where the Bf-109 and Fu-190 maintain superiority. This was not just a tactical tip. It was an admission buried inside acceptable language that the American aircraft was superior in a critical performance regime. Lurch was smuggling the truth past the censors in the only form they would accept. The briefing package was approved. Beetle was repainted in fresh Luftwaffe camouflage. And in February 1944, Circus Rosarius began its tour of frontline fighter bases. The day of truth had arrived. Not in a laboratory, not in a conference room, but on the airfields where German pilots were fighting and dying every day against an enemy they did not fully understand. If the frontline pilots rejected Lurch's assessment, everything he had risked was for nothing. The Frontline Demonstration, 10:30 to 17:30. February 19, 1944. Jagdgeschwader 26, Airfield, Lille Nord, France. One of the Luftwaffe's most elite fighter units. These were not fresh recruits. These were hardened combat veterans who had been fighting the Royal Air Force since 1940 and the Americans since 1943. They had hundreds of kills between them. They believed with considerable justification that they were the best fighter pilots in the world, and they were about to watch a captured American P-47 Thunderbolt fly over their airfield. The morning was cold. Low clouds hung at 3,000 feet. 47 pilots gathered on the flight line, breath steaming in the February air. Most of them were skeptical. They had been fighting P-47s for months. They knew the aircraft. Big, fat, slow in a turn. Easy meat if you caught them low and slow. What could a test pilot from Rechlin tell them that combat had not already taught? The Circus Rosarius team had set up the demonstration carefully. First, a standard Bf-109 G6 took off and climbed to 10,000 feet, circling over the field. Then Lurch took off in Beetle, the captured P-47, and climbed to join. What happened next changed minds. At 10,000 feet, the two aircraft engaged in a mock dogfight. The Bf-109 immediately demonstrated its superiority. Tighter turns, better acceleration, faster climb. Within 2 minutes, the 109 was on the P-47's tail. The pilots on the ground nodded. Exactly what they expected. The American fighter was inferior. Then Lurch called for the second phase. Both aircraft climbed to 25,000 feet. The change was dramatic. At 25,000 feet, the turbo supercharger transformed the P-47 into a completely different animal. The Bf-109 was sluggish now, its engine gasping for air, its controls mushy in the thin atmosphere. The P-47 was in its element. Lurch accelerated away from the 109 with ease. He turned inside it. He climbed above it. He dove on it and pulled away before the 109 pilot could react. The pilots on the ground had gone silent. They were seeing something they had not expected. The fat American fighter was dominating their best aircraft at altitude. Lurch demonstrated one more thing. Starting at 25,000 feet, he pushed the P-47 into a near-vertical dive. The heavy fighter accelerated to speeds that no German fighter could match in a dive. 400 miles per hour. 450. The aircraft remained stable, controllable, deadly. A Bf-109 attempting the same dive would have experienced control stiffening and compressibility effects that made recovery dangerous. He pulled out at 8,000 feet and roared over the airfield at maximum speed. The thunder of the R-2800 engine shook windows in the control tower. After landing, Lurch stood before the assembled pilots of JG-26 and delivered his briefing. He did not mince words. Above 20,000 feet, this aircraft is superior to anything we fly. Its dive performance exceeds ours at any altitude. Its engine is more reliable than ours. Its construction is more robust. It can absorb battle damage that would destroy a Bf-109. A veteran Hauptmann raised his hand. So how do we fight them? You fight them below 15,000 feet where our aircraft have the advantage. You fight them in turning engagements where their weight works against them. You never chase a P-47 in a dive. You never engage one above 20,000 feet unless you have a significant energy advantage. And most importantly, you do not underestimate them. These are not crude machines. These are well-engineered operational fighters. The Hauptmann pressed further. You sound like you admire the aircraft. Lurch met his eyes. I respect what it represents. The Americans are not trying to build the best fighter. They are trying to build enough good fighters to overwhelm us. And I have seen the production numbers. They are succeeding. The briefing room was quiet. These were men who had seen friends die fighting P-47s. Men who had watched damaged Thunderbolts fly home, trailing smoke when a similarly damaged 109 would have disintegrated. Men who had noticed without wanting to admit it that there were more P-47s in the sky every week while their own ranks grew thinner. After the formal briefing, pilots approached Lurch privately. Several admitted they had noticed the same things he described. The American aircraft seemed unkillable. You could put cannon rounds into the engine and it kept running. You could shoot pieces off the tail and it kept flying. One pilot described hitting a P-47 with 3 20mm shells and watching it roll over, dive away, and disappear toward England. His exact words were, "I hit it hard enough to destroy 2 Bf-109s. It flew home." The numbers from the front line confirmed Lurch's laboratory assessment. German fighters in late 1943 had an operational readiness rate of approximately 65%. On any given day, roughly 1/3 of available fighters were grounded for maintenance, lack of parts, or engine problems. American P-47 units, by contrast, maintained readiness rates above 85%. The same number of aircraft on paper translated to a massive numerical advantage in the air. Lurch and the Zirkus Rosarius team visited 7 more fighter bases over the following weeks. At each one, the reaction followed the same pattern. Initial skepticism, the dramatic altitude demonstration, silence, then private admissions that confirmed everything Lurch had been saying. But demonstrating the truth to frontline pilots was one thing. Changing the system was another matter entirely. The reality of industrial war. 1730 to 2200, March 6, 1944. The date that proved Hans Werner Lärche right beyond any possible argument. On that single day, the United States 8th Air Force launched its first major bombing raid against Berlin itself, 660 heavy bombers, escorted by over 800 fighters, P-47 Thunderbolts, P-38 Lightnings, and for the first time in significant numbers, P-51 Mustangs with enough range to fly all the way to Berlin and back. The Luftwaffe scrambled everything it had. The resulting air battle stretched across hundreds of miles of German sky. 69 American bombers were shot down. 11 fighters were lost. But the Luftwaffe lost 80 aircraft that day. 80 fighters that could not be easily replaced, flown by pilots whose experience could never be replaced. And the Americans came back the next day. And the day after that. And the day after that. This was exactly what Lärche had predicted 4 months earlier. Sustained operations. Overwhelming numbers. Consistent operational availability. The Americans were not winning because their pilots were better. They were winning because they could put more aircraft in the sky more consistently. German factories were producing fighters at an accelerating rate. Albert Speer's industrial reorganization pushed production to record numbers. In 1944, Germany would produce over 25,000 aircraft of all types. On paper, this should have been enough. In reality, it was meaningless. New aircraft arrived at frontline bases and sat on the ground because there was no fuel to fly them. Engines manufactured by slave labor in underground factories failed after 30 hours of operation when they should have lasted 300. Replacement parts from different factories did not fit together. A propeller shaft from Factory A would not mate with an engine block from Factory B because tolerances had slipped as experienced machinists were replaced by untrained forced laborers. Lärche watched this happening from Rechlin with growing despair. Every problem he had identified in his November 1943 report was manifesting exactly as he had predicted. The gap was not in technology. It was not in courage. It was not even in numbers, not on paper. The gap was in operational philosophy. American aircraft were designed to work. German aircraft were designed to perform. And in the grinding attrition of total war, working beat performing every single time. By April 1944, Luftwaffe fighter units on the Western Front were losing an average of 50 pilots per week. Not all killed. Some were wounded. Some bailed out and were captured. Some survived crashes. But they were gone from the fight. And the replacements arriving from training schools had as little as 60 hours of total flight time. 60 hours. American pilots arrived at combat units with over 200 hours. These inexperienced German pilots climbed into Bf-109's aircraft designed for experts and died. They ground looped on takeoff. They stalled during combat maneuvers. They could not manage the complex engine controls under stress. Everything that the P-47's forgiving design philosophy was meant to prevent German pilots were experiencing as a death sentence. Lärche's colleague at Rechlin, an engineer named Heinrich Beauvais, wrote in his own notes during this period something that echoed Lärche's earlier assessment. We designed our aircraft for the pilots we had in 1940. The Americans designed their aircraft for the pilots they would have in 1944. They were right. We were wrong. Cliffhanger 2200 to 2330. By the spring of 1944, Lärche's prediction had become Germany's reality. The Luftwaffe was bleeding to death, not from one catastrophic defeat, but from 1,000 daily cuts. Every morning, American formations darkened the sky over the Reich. Every evening, German commanders counted their losses and found fewer aircraft, fewer pilots, fewer parts, fewer options. Lärche continued flying at Rechlin. He tested new German prototypes that promised to turn the tide. Jets, rocket fighters, wonder weapons that propaganda claimed would sweep the Allies from the sky. He flew the Messerschmitt Me-2-6-2. The world's first operational jet fighter, and recognized immediately that it was a genuinely revolutionary aircraft. But he also recognized something else. Something that filled him with a dread far deeper than anything the P-47 evaluation had produced. The Me-262's engines lasted approximately 25 hours before they needed complete replacement. Its fuel consumption was enormous. Its landing speed was so high that it needed long paved runways that were being systematically destroyed by the very bomber formations it was supposed to stop. The jet was faster than anything in the sky. It was also the most maintenance-intensive, fuel-hungry, operationally fragile fighter Germany had ever produced. Germany had learned nothing from Lurch's report. They were still building for peak performance. They were still ignoring operational reliability. They were still designing for aces in a war that was being won by averages. In Part 3, we will see what happened when Germany's wonder weapons met the brutal reality of industrial war. When the fastest fighter in the world proved that speed means nothing if you cannot keep it flying. And when Hans Werner Lerche flew the aircraft that represented Germany's last desperate, doomed attempt to win back the sky. The Luftwaffe was not just losing the air war. It was losing the only kind of war that mattered. The war of numbers. The war of sustainability. The war that a captured P-47 Thunderbolt named Beetle had predicted 8 months before anyone was willing to listen. And by the time they listened, it was already far too late. November 1943. Hans Werner Lerche flew a captured P-47 Thunderbolt and wrote a report predicting the Luftwaffe's destruction. His commanders buried it. By spring 1944, his frontline demonstrations proved what combat pilots already suspected. The Americans were not building better fighters. They were building a better war machine. But here is a number that should stop you cold. On a single day in June 1944, the Allied air forces flew 14,000 sorties over Normandy. 14,000. The Luftwaffe responded with less than 300. Not because they lacked courage. Not because they lacked aircraft on paper. Because they could not keep enough planes flying to fight back. Lerche had predicted this exact moment. The moment when operational philosophy would matter more than any single aircraft, any single pilot, any single battle. And now that moment had arrived with a violence that shocked even the men who had seen it coming. The Luftwaffe's desperate response, 100 to 500. By mid-1944, Luftwaffe leadership could no longer deny reality. The numbers were catastrophic. In the 4 months between January and April 1944, the Luftwaffe lost over 2,000 fighter pilots on the Western Front alone. Not just any pilots. Experienced pilots. Squadron leaders. Flight instructors pulled from training schools and thrown into combat because there was no one else. They called it the defense of the Reich, and it was bleeding Germany's Air Force white. General der Jagdflieger Adolf Gulland watched the destruction from his headquarters and understood exactly what was happening. Every week, American fighter groups rotated fresh pilots into combat with 200+ hours of training. Every week, German replacement pilots arrived with 60 hours, sometimes less. The Americans lost pilots and replaced them with competent ones. Germany lost pilots and replaced them with walking dead men. The Luftwaffe tried everything. They concentrated fighter units into massive formations called Gefechtsverbände, assembling 200 or 300 fighters to attack a single bomber formation with overwhelming local force. The tactic worked exactly once, on April 11, 1944. A massive Luftwaffe formation hit American bombers near Oschersleben and shot down 33 B-17s and B-24s. The American escort fighters, P-47s and P-51s, tore into the German formation from above. 64 German fighters were destroyed, 64 in one engagement. And the critical difference was this. America replaced those 33 bombers within 2 weeks. Germany could not replace 64 experienced fighter pilots in 2 years. Göring raged. He accused his pilots of cowardice. He demanded courts-martial. He replaced commanders. None of it mattered. The problem was not courage. The problem was exactly what Lurch had identified 8 months earlier. Operational sustainability. The side that could keep more aircraft flying more consistently would win. And Germany was losing that war by every possible measure. But the crumbling Luftwaffe was not Lurch's only problem. Something was happening inside Germany's own war machine that threatened to destroy what little rational thinking remained. Crisis from within, 500 to 830. At Rechlin, Lurch continued testing captured aircraft and new German prototypes, and what he found in the prototypes terrified him more than anything the Americans were flying. Germany's answer to the P-47 and P-51 was supposed to be the Messerschmitt Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter. Lurch flew it in the spring of 1944 and immediately recognized its revolutionary potential. The aircraft was 100 miles per hour faster than any Allied fighter. It could climb to 30,000 feet in minutes. In the right hands, it was untouchable. But Lurch was a test pilot, not a propagandist. And his evaluation revealed problems that no amount of propaganda could fix. The Jumo 004 jet engines lasted approximately 25 hours before requiring complete replacement. 25 hours. A Pratt & Whitney R-2800 in a P-47 lasted over 500 hours between overhauls. The Me-262 needed long, smooth paved runways for takeoff and landing. P-47s operated from dirt strips and farm fields. The jet consumed fuel at a rate that made Luftwaffe logistics officers weep. And Germany was running out of fuel. Lurch wrote another report. The Me-262 represents extraordinary performance but catastrophic operational limitations. Without dramatic improvements in engine reliability, fuel availability, and runway infrastructure, this aircraft cannot be sustained in operational service. Hitler himself made the situation worse. He ordered the Me-262 to be used as a bomber, not a fighter, wasting months of production time on a configuration that negated the aircraft's greatest advantages. When it was finally authorized as a fighter, the operational problems Lurch had predicted materialized immediately. Me-262s sat on airfields waiting for engines. They sat waiting for fuel. They sat waiting for the specialized maintenance crews who understood jet technology. On paper, Germany produced over 1,400 Me-262s. In practice, the maximum number operational on any single day never exceeded 200. Germany had learned nothing. Absolutely nothing. They were still building for peak performance while the Americans buried them in operational superiority. The battle that proved everything. 8:30 to 13:30. March 18, 1945. Operation Bodenplatz aftermath had already cost the Luftwaffe its last reserves of experienced pilots. Now the Americans launched the largest single bombing raid in history against Berlin. Over 1,300 heavy bombers, escorted by 14 fighter groups, nearly 1,000 fighters, P-47 Thunderbolts, P-51 Mustangs, a wall of aircraft stretching across the German sky. The Luftwaffe scrambled everything, every fighter that could fly, every pilot who could walk to a cockpit, Bf-109s, FW-190ers, even a handful of Me-262 jets from JG-7, the elite jet fighter unit based at Parchim. The jets hit first. They screamed through the bomber formations at 500 miles per hour, cannons blazing. They were fast. They were deadly. They shot down 8 bombers in the first pass. And then the P-47s came down from 30,000 feet. This is where Lurch's evaluation, written 16 months earlier, played out in blood and fire. The P-47s dove on the Me-262s as they slowed to make their second pass. The Thunderbolts could not match the jets in level flight. But in a dive starting from extreme altitude where their turbo superchargers gave them full power, the P-47s reached speeds that closed the gap. The jets had to evade. And every second spent evading was a second not spent attacking bombers. Below, conventional German fighters tried to climb into the bomber formations. They were met by hundreds of P-47s and P-51s. The battle became a massacre. German fighters, many flown by pilots with less than 100 hours of total flight time, were overwhelmed. They could not manage their aircraft under combat stress. They stalled in tight turns. They lost situational awareness in the chaos. They died. 28 German fighters were shot down that day. 8 bombers were lost. The ratio was devastating. For every bomber destroyed, nearly 4 German fighters were eliminated. And the arithmetic was merciless. America could build 8 bombers in a single day. Germany could not train 28 fighter pilots in a single month. Not anymore. Not with fuel rationed to drops. Not with training bases being overrun. Not with the entire structure of the Luftwaffe collapsing from within. After the mission, a P-47 pilot from the 56th Fighter Group, one of the highest-scoring American units, landed at his base in England, with battle damage that would have destroyed a German fighter. Cannon shell holes in the wing. A section of tail surface shot away, oil streaming from a punctured line. The engine was still running. The pilot taxied to his hardstand, shut down, climbed out, and told his crew chief to patch it up. The aircraft was flying again the next day. A German fighter with equivalent damage would have been scrapped for parts. This was the difference. Not speed, not agility, not pilot skill. Sustainability. The ability to take damage and keep fighting. The ability to repair and return. The ability to replace and continue. Everything Lurch had written in November 1943 was playing out across the skies of dying Germany. Cliffhanger 1330 to 1500. By April 1945, the Luftwaffe existed in name only. Thousands of aircraft sat on airfields with no fuel. Brilliant jets gathered dust in forest clearings where they had been hidden from bombers. Pilots walked away from their machines and simply went home. Hans Werner Lerche was still at Rechlin when Soviet forces approached from the east. He gathered his logbooks, his reports, his evaluations of over 120 aircraft types, and fled west toward the British and American lines. He surrendered to Allied forces carrying the most complete documentation of Luftwaffe flight testing that existed anywhere in the world. American intelligence officers could not believe what they were reading. One man had flown virtually every significant aircraft of the war, Allied and German, and had written honest, detailed, technically precise evaluations of each one. They found his original P-47 report from November 1943. They read his prediction about operational sustainability. They looked at the dates and realized this German test pilot had accurately forecast the destruction of his own Air Force 16 months before it happened. But what happened to Hans Werner Lerche after the war? What happened to the man who told the truth and was ignored? What lessons did the victors learn from his insights, and which lessons did they ignore in turn? In Part 4, we will discover the final chapter of this story. The chapter that connects a captured P-47 Thunderbolt in 1943 to every military aircraft built in the 7 decades since. The chapter that proves Lurch was not just right about World War II. He was right about everything that came after. In November 1943, a German test pilot named Hans Werner Lerche climbed into a captured American P-47 Thunderbolt and discovered something that terrified him. The Americans had not built the best fighter in the sky. They had built something far more dangerous, the most sustainable fighter in history. He wrote a report predicting the Luftwaffe's destruction. His commanders buried it. He demonstrated the truth to frontline pilots. They believed him, but could not change the system. And by spring 1945, every word he had written came true as Germany's Air Force bled to death against an enemy that simply never stopped coming. But what happened to the man who saw it all before anyone else? This story has one final chapter, and it begins not with triumph, but with a test pilot walking west through the ruins of a collapsing empire, carrying a leather case full of documents that the victors would find more valuable than anything Germany's wonder weapons had produced. Because the real weapon was never the aircraft. It was the truth about why one side won and the other lost. Lurch's fate. After the war. 100 to 430. May 1945. Germany surrendered. The Thousand-Year Reich had lasted 12 years and 4 months, and Hans Werner Lerche, the man who had flown over 120 different aircraft types without a single crash, found himself sitting in a British interrogation center with nothing but his logbooks and his memories. He was 30 years old. He had spent his entire adult life inside the Luftwaffe's testing apparatus. He had flown everything from wooden gliders to jet fighters. He had written reports that predicted the future with uncomfortable accuracy. And now, the future he had predicted was standing over him in an Allied uniform asking questions. The British and American intelligence officers who debriefed Lerche were astonished. Most captured German officers offered excuses, propaganda, or silence. Lerche offered data. Precise, honest, technically detailed data about every aircraft he had ever flown, German and Allied alike. His evaluations of captured P-47s, P-51s, Spitfires, and Soviet fighters were gold mines of comparative analysis. One American officer later wrote that Lerche was the most valuable single source of comparative aircraft intelligence they encountered during the entire occupation. Not a general, not a designer, a test pilot who had been honest when honesty was dangerous. But the war's end brought no glory for Lerche. There were no victory parades for German test pilots, no matter how honest their assessments had been. He returned to civilian life in a shattered country where millions were homeless, hungry, and trying to forget. His extraordinary skills were useless in a nation forbidden from building aircraft. His logbooks, the record of 120 aircraft types, sat in a drawer. For years, Lerche worked ordinary jobs. The man who had flown jet fighters and evaluated the most advanced aircraft on Earth found himself grounded by history. Germany's aviation industry was dismantled. The knowledge in his head, the experience in his hands, had no market in a country rebuilding from rubble. But Lerche did something during those quiet years that would eventually reach further than any of his wartime reports. He wrote, carefully, methodically, with the same brutal honesty that had made him enemies in the Third Reich, he compiled his experiences into a manuscript. Every aircraft, every evaluation, every ignored warning. The book would eventually be published as Luftwaffe Test Pilot, and it would become one of the most respected primary sources on World War II aviation ever written. The man the Nazis had dismissed as a defeatist became one of history's most trusted witnesses. But his real legacy was not a book. The legacy that changed everything. 430 to 830. Lerche's insights about operational philosophy versus peak performance did not die with the Third Reich. They became the foundation of modern military aircraft design. When the United States Air Force was established as an independent service in 1947, its procurement philosophy was built on exactly the principle Lerche had identified. Operational reliability first. Peak performance second. The first generation of American jet fighters, the F-86 Sabre, the F-84, Thunderjet, inherited the P-47's DNA, not its shape, not its engine, its philosophy. Build tough, build reliable, build maintainable, build for the average pilot, not the ace. The Soviet Union learned the same lesson from the other side. Soviet aircraft designers like Mikoyan and Lavochkin had built fighters during the war using the same mass production philosophy as the Americans. The MiG-15 that shocked American pilots over Korea in 1950 was designed to be simple, rugged, and producible in enormous numbers. Lerche would have recognized the thinking immediately. The principle extended far beyond fighters. The American B-52 Stratofortress, which first flew in 1952, was designed with the same operational philosophy. It was not the fastest bomber, it was not the most advanced, but it was reliable, maintainable, and sustainable. 73 years later, the B-52 is still flying, still operational, still doing its job. The aircraft that were supposed to replace it have come and gone. The B-52 endures because it was designed to endure. In Vietnam, the F-4 Phantom carried the philosophy forward. In the Gulf War, the A-10 Warthog, an aircraft that looks remarkably like a spiritual descendant of the P-47, proved that rugged, survivable, maintainable design could dominate a modern battlefield. The A-10 was called ugly. It was called unsophisticated. Pilots called it the Warthog, and it destroyed more Iraqi armor than any other aircraft in the coalition. The P-47 Thunderbolt itself compiled a staggering record. Over the course of the war, Thunderbolts flew 546,000 combat sorties. They destroyed 9,000 locomotives, 86,000 railroad cars, 68,000 trucks, and 6,000 armored vehicles. They dropped 132,000 tons of bombs and fired 135 million rounds of ammunition. They shot down 3,752 enemy aircraft in air combat, and they did all of this while maintaining the highest operational readiness rate of any American fighter in the European theater. Over 15,600 were built, one every hour at peak production, and the total cost of the entire P-47 program was less than the cost of the aircraft Germany lost trying to stop them. But the biggest lesson from Lurch's story is not about aircraft at all. The deeper lesson. 830 to 1200. Lurch's story is ultimately about what happens when institutions refuse to hear uncomfortable truths. The Luftwaffe did not lose the air war because German engineers were incompetent. They were brilliant. The Bf-109 was a masterpiece. The Me-262 was revolutionary. German aeronautical engineering was among the finest in the world. They lost because the system that controlled those engineers was incapable of accepting information that contradicted its own mythology. German engineering superiority was not just a technical belief. It was an ideological position. Questioning it was not just unpopular, it was politically dangerous. And so the men who saw the truth, men like Lurch, men like Galland, were silenced, sidelined, or ignored. This pattern repeats throughout history with terrifying consistency. Before Pearl Harbor, American intelligence officers warned that the Japanese Navy was capable of a carrier strike on Hawaii. They were ignored because the institutional belief was that Japan would never dare attack. Before the Tet Offensive in 1968, intelligence analysts warned that the North Vietnamese were planning a massive coordinated assault. They were ignored because the institutional belief was that the enemy was too weakened to attack. In every case, the information existed. The analysis was correct. The warnings were clear, and the institution chose comfortable lies over uncomfortable truths. Lurch saw in 90 minutes of flying what the entire Luftwaffe command structure refused to see in 2 years of losing. Not because they lacked intelligence, because they lacked the courage to accept what their intelligence was telling them. And there is one final detail about this story that almost nobody knows. The final revelation. 1200 to 1330. The P-47. Thunderbolt that Lurch flew, the aircraft nicknamed Beetle serial number 42-22490, survived the war. After serving with Zircus Rosarius as a demonstration aircraft, it was flown to various Luftwaffe bases throughout 1944. It was last recorded at a German airfield in early 1945. When Allied forces overran that airfield, they found Beetle sitting in a damaged hangar, still wearing its Luftwaffe camouflage and the code T9 plus FK. An American ground crew recognized what it was. An American P-47 in German markings. They checked the serial number and traced it back to Lieutenant William Roach of the 355th Fighter Group, the man who had accidentally landed at a German airfield in November 1943. Roach himself survived the war as a prisoner. He was liberated in April 1945 and returned to the United States. He never knew that his aircraft, the one he had accidentally delivered to the enemy, had been flown by the most important test pilot in the Luftwaffe, had generated a report that predicted Germany's defeat and had been demonstrated to frontline German fighter pilots as proof that America was winning the industrial war. One pilot's worst day became history's most important flight evaluation. A navigation error in bad weather produced a document that accurately forecast the destruction of an air force 16 months before it happened. Conclusion: 1330 to 1500. From a test pilot with an honest report that nobody wanted to read to a prediction that proved right in every single detail, Hans Werner Lerche flew a captured P-47 Thunderbolt for 90 minutes and understood what the entire German High Command refused to accept: that in industrial war reliability defeats brilliance, that sustainability defeats supremacy, that the side which keeps more machines running more consistently will always outlast the side that builds fewer perfect machines. 15,600 P-47 Thunderbolts, 546,000 combat sorties, 85% operational readiness maintained across years of sustained combat, against a Luftwaffe that lost 21,000 aircraft in 6 months because it could not keep its fighters flying. The numbers do not lie. They never did. Lerche saw them in November 1943, wrote them down, and watched them become reality. The lesson is as true today as it was 80 years ago. In any sustained conflict, whether military, industrial, or personal, the winner is not the one with the most brilliant solution. The winner is the one who can keep showing up, day after day, mission after mission, reliable, consistent, unbreaking. The P-47 Thunderbolt was not the best fighter of World War II. It was heavy. It was ugly. German pilots called it a flying milk bottle. But it kept flying when everything else fell out of the sky. And in the end, that was the only thing that mattered. Build for war. Build to last. Build to keep fighting when everything says you should stop. That is the lesson of Beetle. That is the legacy of Lerche. And that is why this story 80 years later still matters.